The wind in Chicago doesn't just blow, it carves. On this particular Tuesday, it was carving straight through Clara's thin, donated sweater, mocking the layers she had wrapped around herself to survive the night. She stood at the edge of the North Bridge, her eyes fixed on the flickering digital clock of a distant bank building. Asterisk, 11:58 p.m. Asterisk. In exactly 2 minutes, the last bus, the only heated transport to the city's overflow shelter, would pull away from the curb. If she wasn't on it, she wouldn't just be cold, she would be a statistic. In 10-degree weather, the pavement becomes a predator. Clara tightened her grip on a plastic bag containing 2 bruised apples and a loaf of bread. She began to run, her boots slipping on the treacherous patches of black ice. Just 60 seconds more, she told herself. Just stay upright. Then the sound hit her. It wasn't the wind. It was a wet, ragged gasp. The sound of air trying to force its way through a closing throat. Clara skidded to a halt. Slumped against the iron railing was a man. At a glance, he looked like a king who had fallen from a throne. His overcoat was thick camel hair, his shoes polished leather, but his face was a terrifying shade of slate gray. He was clutching his chest with a hand that wore a gold watch, but his fingers were blue. "Help, please!" he wheezed. His eyes were wide, panicked, and darting around the empty bridge. Clara looked at her watch. Asterisk 11:59 p.m. The yellow glow of the bus appeared at the far intersection. It was slowing down. In 60 seconds, those doors would hiss shut, and her chance at a warm bed would vanish into the exhaust fumes. "Sir?" Clara knelt beside him, the cold from the concrete seeping instantly into her knees. "Sir, I have to go. I have to catch that bus." The man didn't answer. His head fell back against the railing with a dull thud. His breathing stopped. Not a slow fade, a sudden, violent silence. Clara looked back at the bus. The driver was shifting into gear. She could see the steam rising from the engine. All she had to do was turn her back. She could tell herself he was just another drunk, like the 3 cars that had already sped past him. She could convince herself that someone else would come along. But as she looked at the stranger's lifeless hand, she realized that if she left, she wasn't just catching a bus, she was leaving a man to become a corpse. "No," she whispered, the word turning to ice in the air. Clara dropped her groceries. The bread rolled into the gutter, but she didn't care. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her last $5 bill, the fare that was her literal lifeline, and watched the wind rip it from her fingers, sending it spiraling into the dark river below. She had made her choice. The bus roared, its tires splashing slush as it pulled away. The red taillights grew smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the falling snow. Clara was alone. No money, no coat, and no way home. She turned to the man, her hands shaking as she remembered a basic first aid video she'd watched in a public library months ago. She locked her elbows, placed her palms on the center of that expensive coat, and began to push. 1, 2, 3, 4, she gritted her teeth. The wind howled, trying to knock her over, but Clara anchored herself. She wasn't just fighting for his heart to beat, she was fighting the entire world that had decided this man. And people like her weren't worth stopping for. Every second was a gamble. Her fingers were losing feeling. Her ears were burning with frostbite. But in that frozen silence, under the shadow of the Chicago skyline, Clara refused to let go. She had sacrificed her night of safety for a stranger's last chance, and she wasn't going to let the cold win. Clara looked down at the $5 bill in her hand. It was crumpled, stained with a bit of grease, from a kitchen shift she'd worked 3 days ago, and it was the most valuable thing she owned. To anyone else, it was pocket change, the price of a fancy coffee. To Clara, it was a miracle. It was a seat on the last bus, a ticket to a room with a heater that hummed and the only thing standing between her and a night spent shivering in a cardboard box behind a grocery store. The bus was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the thick, swirling snow. The driver was looking at his watch. He didn't like to wait. "Wait!" Clara shouted, her voice thin, but then she heard it. A heavy, sickening thud. Behind her, the man in the camel hair coat had collapsed completely. He wasn't just leaning anymore. He was face down on the salt-stained pavement. His suitcase had burst open, scattering papers that the wind immediately began to steal. But he didn't move to grab them. He didn't move at all. Clara stopped. Her heart was a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. She looked at the bus driver, who was now pulling the lever to close the folding doors. "Sir, wait! There's a man hurt!" Clara yelled, waving her arms. The driver glanced through the glass, his expression weary and indifferent. He'd seen 1,000 people down on the sidewalk in this city. He looked at the clock, then at Clara. He gestured impatiently toward the fare box. He wasn't getting out. He wasn't helping. Either she got on now, or she stayed in the dark. Clara looked back at the man on the ground. A businessman in a luxury car sped past, splashing icy slush onto the man's motionless body. The driver didn't even tap his brakes. A woman walking a dog on the opposite side of the street tightened her grip on the leash and crossed the road, her eyes fixed forward, pretending the scene didn't exist. The world was moving on. The world had decided this man was invisible. Clara felt the weight of the $5 bill in her palm. If she stayed, the money was useless. There were no more buses. No taxis would stop for a girl in a threadbare hoodie in this neighborhood. By choosing him, she was choosing to lose everything she had spent, weeks shivering and starving to save. She was choosing to be cold. She was choosing to be unsafe. "I can't," she whispered to the wind. But she looked at the man's hand, pale, trembling, reaching for a life that was slipping away. And she thought of her own mother's last words. "Never let the world make you cold on the inside, Clara." She turned her back on the bus. She walked to the edge of the bridge railing and opened her hand. The wind, violent and hungry, snatched the $5 bill instantly. She watched it disappear into the gray abyss of the river below. It was gone. Her safety was gone. Her bed was gone. The bus hissed, the sound of the air brakes signaling the end of her hope. It pulled away, its red taillights blinking like mocking eyes before vanishing into the white wall of the blizzard. Clara knelt in the slush. She didn't have a coat to give him, so she took off her own thin hoodie, leaving herself in nothing but a t-shirt. The cold hit her like a physical blow, 1,000 needles piercing her skin, but she didn't flinch. She wrapped the cloth around the man's neck, trying to keep the heat from escaping his body. "I'm here," she said, her teeth beginning to chatter so hard it hurt. "I gave it up for you. You don't get to quit now. You hear me? I'm cold, so you have to be warm. Stay with me." She was a girl with nothing, sacrificing the only thing she had for a man who had everything, yet had no one. As the frost began to settle on her eyelashes, Clara held his hand with a grip that wouldn't let go, proving that the most expensive thing in the world isn't gold. It's the mercy of a stranger who has every reason to walk away, but stays anyway. The city was a graveyard of empathy, and the North Bridge was its newest tomb. Clara stood over the fallen man, her hands trembling as she looked into the faces of the people passing by. She expected a rush of footsteps, the frantic dialing of phones, or at least a gasp of concern. Instead, she witnessed the cold, calculated machinery of human indifference. A sleek black SUV slowed down as it approached the scene. The headlights illuminated the man's twisted body, turning the falling snow into glittering diamonds. Clara waved her arms frantically, her eyes wide with a silent plea. For a second, she locked eyes with the driver, A middle-aged man in a sharp suit, his face bathed in the blue glow of his dashboard. He looked at the man on the ground, then at Clara's tattered clothes. His lip curled in a subtle sneer of disgust. With a flick of his wrist, he accelerated, the tires kicking up a spray of dirty, salty slush that coated the man's expensive wool coat. He didn't see a human being in crisis. He saw a nuisance. "Please!" Clara screamed as another car whizzed by, the driver not even bothering to look. A couple walked toward them on the narrow sidewalk, huddled under a large, sturdy umbrella. They were laughing about a dinner party until they saw the man slumped against the railing. The laughter died, but it wasn't replaced by pity. "Ugh, not again," the woman muttered, pulling her designer purse closer to her chest and stepping toward the very edge of the curb to avoid touching the man's outstretched hand. The city really needs to do something about these drunks. It's not safe to walk here at night anymore. "Just keep moving, Sarah," her companion replied, his voice flat and annoyed. "He's probably just passed out from the bottle. If you touch them, they never leave you alone. It's a scam, Clara. Don't fall for it." Clara stared at them, her jaw dropping. "He's not drunk. He's having a heart attack. Look at his face." The man didn't even turn his head. "Not our problem, kid. Call the cops if you're so worried, but don't expect a thank you when he wakes up and asks you for $20. They disappeared into the curtain of white, their footsteps rhythmic and steady, leaving the silence of the bridge even heavier than before. The contrast was staggering. The man on the ground was draped in wealth. A gold watch, a tailored coat, leather shoes that cost more than Clara's entire life. Yet he was being treated like trash because he was vulnerable. Clara, who possessed nothing but a heavy heart and a thin sweater, was the only one who saw his humanity. The air grew thicker with tension. Each car that passed felt like a slap. Each person who turned their head felt like a betrayal of the basic contract of being human. The anger began to burn in Clara's chest, hotter than the biting wind. She looked at the man's flickering eyelids. He was hearing them. He was hearing the world decide he wasn't worth the effort. He was dying in a crowd of thousands, and he was completely alone. "They're wrong," Clara whispered, leaning close to his ear, her voice thick with a fierce, protective rage. "I see you. You're not a drunk. You're someone's father. You're someone's son. You're staying here with me." She realized then that her choice wasn't just about saving a life. It was a protest. It was a refusal to become like the ghosts in the cars and the shadows under the umbrellas. In a world that had mastered the art of looking away, Clara forced herself to look closer. Her heroism wasn't in her strength, but in her refusal to let the city's heart stay as frozen as its streets. She held his hand tighter, a small, defiant flame against a freezing tide of indifference. The air on the bridge didn't just feel cold. It felt like a physical weight, a jagged blade of ice that slid down Clara's throat with every breath. It was the kind of atmospheric cruelty that turns oxygen into a chore. As she knelt over the fallen man, the world was no longer a city of lights and sounds. It was a symphony of sensory agony. She looked at his face. It wasn't just pale. It had turned the color of damp ash, a sickly, translucent gray that made his skin look like parchment, stretched too thin over a skeleton. His lips, once likely full of life and command, were now a terrifying shade of bruised indigo. Blue-lipped and trembling, they looked like flower petals caught in a frost. Every time he tried to draw air, it sounded like gravel being crushed in a tin can, a dry, rattling wheeze that made Clara's own lungs ache in sympathy. She reached out to grab his hand, and the sensation sent a jock through her system. His skin wasn't just chilled. It felt like touching a piece of meat left too long in a deep freeze. It was a dense, unresponsive cold that seemed to pull the heat straight out of her marrow. "Stay with me," she whispered, but her own voice sounded foreign to her. Her jaw was so stiff from the biting wind that the words came out like the grinding of rusted gears. As the minutes ticked by, the environment began to colonize her body. Her arms, which had been pumping rhythmically against his chest in a desperate attempt at CPR, began to transform. They weren't muscles and bone anymore. They felt like lead-heavy beams, dull and sluggish. Each time she pushed down, a searing heat flared in her shoulders, the only warmth she could feel. But it was the heat of exhaustion, not life. The wind shrieked through the steel cables of the bridge, a high-pitched, metallic scream that drowned out the distant hum of the city. The snow wasn't falling softly like a postcard. It was stinging, horizontal needles that bit into the exposed skin of her cheeks until they went from burning red to a deathly, numb white. She could smell the ozone of the coming storm, mixed with the sharp, chemical scent of the road salt and the faint, expensive cologne lingering on the man's coat. A smell of cedar and bergamot that felt absurdly out of place in this gutter. Her vision began to tunnel. The edges of her sight were rimmed with a hazy, crystalline blur. The red taillights of the retreating bus were no longer vehicles. They were bleeding stabs of crimson in a sea of blinding white. The world had narrowed down to the rhythmic thud-thud of her palms against his sternum, and the sight of her own fingernails turning a dark, oxygen-starved purple. She felt the vibration of the bridge beneath her, the low, tectonic rumble of a heavy truck passing in the far lane. The salt on the pavement crunched like broken glass under her knees, digging into her skin, but the pain was distant, muffled by the sheer density of the freezing air. This wasn't a cold night. This was a sensory war. Clara wasn't just waiting. She was being dissolved by the elements. Yet, in that frozen vacuum, the only thing that felt real was the microscopic spark of heat where her palm met the man's chest. It was a tiny, flickering candle of life in a universe of ice, and she refused to let the wind blow it out. The sterile white lights of the hospital lobby were a jarring contrast to the jagged shadows of the bridge. Clara sat tucked into a corner of a vinyl chair, her small frame swallowed by a borrowed hospital blanket. She looked down at her hands. They were raw and red, the skin cracked from the wind, still vibrating with a phantom rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. She had no money for a phone call, no bus fare to leave, and no home to return to. She was exactly what she had been 4 hours ago. A girl who didn't exist in the eyes of the city. To the nurses rushing by, she was just a stray who had come in with a trauma case. She was waiting for a sign, a breath, a reason to believe that the $5 bill she threw to the wind had bought something worth having. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit hissed open. A woman stepped out, her face a mask of exhausted elegance. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the disheveled girl in the corner. Behind her stood a man in a lab coat, nodding toward Clara. The woman walked over, her heels clicking like a countdown on the polished tile. She stopped in front of Clara and sank to her knees, ignoring the dirt and slush on the floor that ruined her expensive silk trousers. "My father is awake," the woman said, her voice a fragile thread. "The surgeons, they said he shouldn't be here. They said the cold should have taken him in 10 minutes. But he told them about a girl. He said he felt a hand that wouldn't let go. He heard a voice that kept ordering him to stay." She reached out, tentatively taking Clara's scarred, freezing hands into her own, which were warm and soft. "You're Clara, aren't you? The paramedics found your library card in your hoodie pocket." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "My father is Arthur Vance," the woman continued, tears finally spilling over. "He spent his whole life building an empire because he thought that was the only way to be safe. He thought the world was a cold place where everyone only looked out for themselves. Last night, he was dying, surrounded by his own wealth, and it couldn't save him. His gold watch couldn't call an ambulance. His coat couldn't start his heart. She squeezed Clara's hands. You gave up your seat on that bus. You gave up your safety. You became his heart when his own failed. You saw him when the rest of the world saw a ghost. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, holding a simple manila envelope. The woman took it and placed it in Clara's lap. Inside this is the deed to a small property in the suburbs, a house with a garden and a fireplace that will never go cold. There is also a trust established in your name. It covers your education, your health, and your future, my father insisted. He said he spent 60 years looking for a person like you, and he had to almost die to find one. Clara looked at the envelope, then back at the woman. The weight of it felt impossible. For years, she had walked the streets of Chicago as a shadow, a girl ignored by every passerby, a ghost in a hoodie. She had been the one looking for a hand to hold, and in the moment she chose to be that hand for someone else, the world finally looked back. You aren't a stranger anymore, Clara, the woman whispered. You're family. As the sun began to rise over the city, painting the skyscrapers in hues of gold and rose, Clara walked toward the hospital exit. She wasn't running for a bus. She wasn't checking a clock. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the cold. She was finally seen.